The Five Rings Podcast. Road to Tokyo on the Sport Podcasting Network. Your weekly fix leading up to the 2020 Olympic Games with Duane Rollins and Kevin Laramée. Follow us and listen to us live on Twitter at Five Rings Podcast and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network for more content.
Good day, good night, and welcome to the Five Rings Podcast. I'm Kevin Laramée with Duane Rollins. As always, the holiday season is upon us, which means winter is upon us. The winter season has truly begun in full with skiing, of course, but also other sports have started over the last few weeks. We've seen sliding sports and others are starting. But first of all, how you doing, Duane?
Well, whenever I hear our new intro, I wonder if people know that what it is. It's a mashup of Summer Games 1 and Summer Games 2 from the old systems back in the day. So I when I hear that, I want to go out and find an emulator so I can play those video games of my youth, do that high jump or the triple jump again.
Yeah, it's a very meta mashup that I made. Of course, the beginning of it is linked with the history of this show also because it was the beginning of the intro of the first iteration, or I would say just the beginning of it until the rebranding and the new logos and new audio. So I thought the second version fit as well with the new opening credits. So no, that's why. But no, I agree with you. I do feel like playing some summer games.
Yeah, I can still do the joystick movements, especially for the pole vault. It was all about you go back and then go forward and press the button and go forward at the last second. It's still a skill to do. I was pretty good at the pole vault. Like you couldn't get above 6 meters though. 590 was as high as anyone could ever get that I ever saw. So if you're listening and you know first off, what the hell we're talking about. Second off, if you ever got over 6 meters, let me know because that would be a true Christmas miracle for all of us.
Yeah, and we'll get to the winter season in a couple of minutes. Duane will talk about what we expect to happen, but more what we're looking forward out of 2019, 2020. It's like a mid-cycle year. It's a summer Olympic game next year, July 24th to be exact. And on July 24th, of course, will be the opening ceremony of Tokyo 2020. And during this ceremony, there'll be a new order for the Parade of Nations. Of course, Greece will always be number one, I imagine, but still number one. Second, the team of refugees, the Olympic refugee teams that made their debut in Rio, will now be second. They were second to last before, but this time they'll get more exposure, being the second team to march into the stadiums. And of course, the host country will still be last, but the next host will be second to last, and so forth. So this is pretty much the changes that the IOC announced a couple of days ago on their live press conference.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, who cares? But on another level, it does give the refugee athletes a lot more visibility than they had at the second to last. Because let's face it, the Parade of Nations has become very bloated over the past few Olympics. As more and more athletes, more and more countries even go to the games, and it just becomes larger and larger and longer and longer. I love the opening ceremonies, but it is a bit of a buzzkill, especially as a Canadian, because think about this for a second. It's happening, and you get the first couple acts, and you're all excited, and the Parade of Nations starts. You see Greece roll out there. You get some feel-good stuff. Canada, C.
Yeah,
unless it's some other alphabet, it's pretty quick, and then wait.
Was it in 2004 that in Greek Canada doesn't start with a C, right? In Greek, Canada starts with another letter, so it was a little further down the road. We had to wait for Canada, but no, I agree with you exactly. We see Canada, at least for us, like we see Canada at the beginning. Then I'm always excited to see the United States too, right? Sorry.
So then you go have a nap for a while.
Then you're good for an hour and a half, if not two. And then I see the United States because they always have intricate uniforms or costumes or just clothing when they come in. It's always like Ralph Lauren or a designer. It's always extravagant, and I kind of like my fashion. Might not show when I'm wearing it now, but I kind of like my fashion, so I do like to watch them. But there's a long stretch of countries that, no offense, but I don't relate to.
Well, no, and I mean, look, they all deserve their place in the games, obviously, and there's
Of
some
course.
fun moments in there. You get what was it, the
Oh yeah,
Tongan
the
fellow with
Tonga
his
guy. Are we going to see him
yeah,
again? We're probably going to see him in Tokyo in some fashion. Come on.
yeah, he's a staple now. I think they'll keep him till he's like 80 and walking out there
He's
with all oiled up.
still going to look better than I would ever, than I'll ever
Yeah,
look. So.
probably. Well, no comment there, but it's yeah. Here's the thing though. Okay, they're having the next host second last, and I don't really understand the purpose of that, other than I guess to, remind people where to go. I don't know. But, I don't know. I think
According
figure it out.
according to Thomas Bach, it's to give him a bit more exposure and to get some trepidation heading into their time in the spotlight. But it's to share the spotlight, I guess. But it's not just the next host; it's the one after. So this time around, the U.S. will be, of course, second to last. And then you'll have, 2024.
Yeah.
Who's in 2024? It's LA, right? So 2024 will be
24 is Paris. So you got
Paris.
France.
So France
US,
will be second to last. U.S., France, and then it'll be Japan.
To give them more exposure, because here's two countries in the world that need more exposure: France and the United States of America.
Especially recently, when the two head of states of this country can't get along. So there you go.
Here, okay, Kevin. Here, you can only talk about this so long. But it occurred to me today that I would never want to take parade nations away from the countries, but from the athletes, I should say, that want to march in them. But increasingly, what you're finding is like the elite athletes don't want to march in it because it's a burden to them, and you have the whole flag bearer stuff and all that. And that is a neat tradition, and we like to talk about it at the time of the games. But maybe there's a way to speed it up a little bit. And what I'm thinking is, what would make a lot of sense is just have all of the flags come in at once, and then all of the athletes, just like in the closing ceremonies, come in at once as well. Yeah, still going to take a while, but do we really need to? Yeah, do we really need to have like Angola? And then you're watching on TV.
Four people coming in. But it would be though a big difference, right? It is a big change when we look at tradition. What is so important in the Olympic movement? The Olympic ceremony is usually there's traditions, and this is one of them. And I guess it would change that. So I guess I would be against your idea just because I am all for change. I'm all for progress, but sometimes I kind of like things the way they were too.
I just want to watch an interpretive dance of Hello Kitty for 10 more minutes during the Japanese games, because it's always cliche and stereotypical. So that's what I would assume it's going to be. When it's in Canada, it's moose and symbolic flag light or torch lighting. So that's what we do. But
what we do is we mess up the lighting of the flame. But we talked about this last week.
Yeah, well, we talked about it in our doc, but which is part 2 is coming up soon. We're busy getting prepared to talk about the gymnastics and the boxing, gymnastics and decathlon, the perfect tens of the 1976 Montreal Olympics. If you hadn't had a chance to listen to that documentary series, there's a free preview on the main network, or you can get it for how much, Kevin?
$5 a month, and right now all the way till tomorrow, so that's Friday, December 6th. If you sign up for the $5 tier of our Patreon page at patreon.com/sportspodcastnetwork, you get the documentary tier for 6 months. So it's a good buy. It's a good, not buy as in bye-bye, but it's a good purchase. So we do thank you for your support, and you also get the 5 rings extra at the $5 tier, where Duane and I have a miniseries, 8-part miniseries on the 1976 Montreal Olympics. In episode 1, talking about the context, the political context, and municipal context, and sports context at the time came out last week, and is available on our Patreon feed once again. But to finish off on the nation's order, the only really important thing that kind of I want to know is Russia. Will it be there? Will it not be there? We don't have a resolution to that yet. The only thing that the IOC mentioned yesterday on another press conference that I was watching on their Twitter feed is that they're going to wait till the recommendation of what comes out probably next week and then act on them, they said. So we'll see.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't have a lot of faith that they're going to act as strongly as I think they need to. I suspect that there will be a half measure that is put in place, similar to what we saw in the previous Olympic Games, similar to what we saw in the World Track and Field Championships that recently finished. So we continue. And I mean, look, doping, we talked at length last week. I don't really want to get into it this week because we like to sort of separate our doping conversations by a couple of weeks, because otherwise people will just, start to turn out of it. But
otherwise, we're a doping show, we're not an Olympic show. That there's a difference there.
Yeah, well, no, and to be honest, though, I do think that people tune out after a while. If you just talk negative, we do want to talk about the sports side of things and the joy that we love. We have an Olympic show because we love the Olympics, not to talk about the problems, right? But you can't ignore them. Anyway, yeah, I do think that I don't suspect there will be a Russia in the marching orders, but I suspect there will be Russians in the parade.
Yep. Well, we know at least one sports where one nation won't be at. Iran will not be in the judo competition in the next Olympics, Tokyo 2020, for refusing to fight Israeli athletes.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Well, it's a sad one, but because they don't recognize the state of Israel, basically, is the long and the short of this, which is a problem. I don't think I'm overly political to say that. It's a problem to not recognize an entire nation because you don't believe in them as people. But nonetheless, what had happened here is there was an entire investigation, because it wasn't that they were just overtly saying no, like that would be obvious. What they were doing, though, is that if there was a possibility, like when the draws were made, they would look at the draw, and if there was a possibility that fighter would have to perhaps face an Israeli athlete, they would fight until, like, for instance, if they were drawn directly against them, then that athlete would develop a mysterious ankle twist just before he went on the mat, right? Or there was a case in the recent World Championships where an athlete admitted that he was told to throw the match lest he be drawn against the Israeli athlete in the semifinals. And the Judo Federation found strong evidence that this was happening, and this was a state-ordered direction. So the only recourse they felt they had would be to just eliminate them. If you don't want to fight them, you can't fight anyone. And I can't argue with that logic.
Well, no, they're not there to necessarily take sides on whether they're right or wrong or whatever, but it is a offense to what should be in the spirit of the game or spirit of the sport, which is politics are not involved in it. And if that decision is state sponsored, then politics are involved in it. And there's, like you mentioned, not millions of different type of recourses you can have. It's either what other you cannot you can just suspend them, but which means that they'll miss the next Olympics, which is the case.
Yeah, well, look, they focused on the sporting side of this. They're not having a pure sporting result, is what kind of how they go down in this, and that's how they avoid the politics. And it's not the only sport that's done this in the past. We think of the last Olympics, in the badminton competition, and we remember it here because a Canadian women's pairs team, benefited from it. Got to fight. That would be a different kind of badminton game. Get to play.
that badminton might be a bit more popular.
Yeah, got to play for the bronze medal.
Pay-per-view.
In the poll system, they had found that they were manipulating results because they had already determined that they were going through, and then it got a little complicated. But so it's not without precedence that a sports federation would sanction someone at the Olympic level for not playing fair. So in this particular case, there's sort of an ugly undercurrent to it. But like I said, if you're not, if you're throwing matches purposely, regardless of the reason, you're really not fighting to the spirit of the rules. And it's a shame that the athletes themselves are getting victimized here. But as we talked about with Russia last week, there comes a point where that's the only recourse you have. It's the nuclear option, and it might be the only one that works.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was reading a quote from Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and everything that Zlatan says, and famous soccer player if you don't know, and everything that he says you have to take with a grain of salt. But he was talking about the racism in sports and soccer, especially, and probably the recent events in Italy. And mentioned, like, it's all well and good to wear a T-shirt that says "Say no to racism," but that's not going to change anything. If you really want to make a change, dog to 3 points, stop the game, award the points to the other one, and if they don't comply, relegate them. It's not like you have thousands of ways to make them obey the rules. And it's either money, like big money fines, or you ban people. In soccer, it would be a relegation, which is like banning almost. But in this case, would be to outright just ban Iran from the judo competition. And it's not fair for the athletes, but the athletes are employees of the state in this context, and the state decided to counterveit the rules. And it has nothing to do, like when you mentioned throwing the match, right? It doesn't matter your reasoning behind the throwing the match. It could be political, it could be for other reasons. It's the act of throwing the match that led to this ban, and not the reasoning behind throwing the match.
Precisely. And as you say, there's not much recourse there at that point. Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation that you talked about there's no politics in it. That's silly to say, and we understand that though, right? There is always politics, but the politics can only go so far before you have to make a stand for sport, and that's what they've done in this particular case, stand for their sport in judo. And Iran is a decent country in the sport, but it won't affect the competition overly. So we'll still go out and enjoy it. I love watching the martial arts sports in this. It's a shame that karate is only going to get one kick at the can. They're already out at the Paris Games, but nonetheless, I'll enjoy watching it when it's there.
I will get to watch at least a one-time thing, and it's going to be a great martial arts competition as a whole, I think, in Tokyo. And starting on July 24th, Tokyo, the Fight Rings podcast will be daily, maybe a couple of days before that, and daily for sure during the Olympic Games, as we have been doing since 2014. So this would be our fourth Olympic Games?
Fourth would be fourth. It's our second of both. Yeah, our second full cycle will be done.
Wow.
Because we started with the Winter Games, we'll consider the Winter Games the start of the cycle, which makes us unique. But nonetheless, that's where we started.
That's where the 2014 Sochi. All right, another news, I guess, in the world of Olympics. Some politicians in the USA, American politicians, have starting to talk about the B word, like a boycott of Beijing 2022 in response of the recent upheaval, I would qualify, in Hong Kong, and the response of the government towards that upheaval, and also versus recent relationship between organizations and NBA and the Hong Kong and the Chinese government.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the NBA owner that said basically that the people should be allowed to speak out against Hong Kong said it was a shame what's happening there. So, look, yes, the B word has been mentioned a couple times in certain American circles. Now, a couple thoughts on that. First off, I take it with a giant grain of salt. It's an election year. There's one thing happens every year. Next year is there's three things that happen. There's a leap year. It is an election year, but more important to us, it's an Olympic year. Yeah. So that's how you remember when Olympics happen. They're on presidential election years or leap years, or in my case, that's how you remember when presidential elections and leap years happen. But nonetheless,
it's like, oh yeah, there's an Olympics, so it means that this is going to be an election.
So yes, when you have politicians talking tough about this and using the boycott threats, you got to take it with a grain of salt. Now, I put this on the agenda because I do think there is a conversation to be had about whether we'll ever see a boycott again, a significant boycott again. And with the world becoming more and more politically divided, it's starting to worry me. And the athletes will be used as pawns in these particular cases. You're already kind of see it in certain ways, and I don't want to get into right-left politics here, but there is like tons of examples in the United States right now of how athletes are being used to further agendas, whether it be left or right. And I just hope that there's enough voices in the sports circles out there that will shout down any call of a boycott, because I don't think a damn thing was ever proven by them. We're going to talk about what we call the forgotten boycott, the 76 boycott of the African nations in a bit. That's the only one that I can kind of justify in my mind, because it related to apartheid, and that whole shutting South Africa consistently out for 20 years did ultimately play a role in eliminating what was clearly a terrible policy. But 80, 84, what was accomplished by it? I don't know.
Well, nothing really. And that's, I guess, especially nowadays, what you would do is alienate a lot of American companies that have a lot invested in the Olympic movement heading into an Olympic Games. And yes, it might be a bit different this time around, but if you look at American companies and NBC with the rights, and you would cost a lot of revenue to your own businesses and big backers also of your political movement. So because it's an election year, I think the money always speaks, right? The money talks, and the money might it might be counterintuitive, but it might not make sense business-wise for the United States to boycott an Olympic Games in this landscape of the sports world.
It's just not the right environment. I mean, it ties into our last topic. Yes, in our particular case here in the Western world, we view what's happening, for the most part, we view what's happening in Hong Kong as a positive development of people standing up for their democratic rights, right? I mean, without getting into the nitty gritty of it, that's essentially what most people look at it. Oh, they're speaking up for democracy. They're speaking up for their own rights. Good. That's a good thing. We should support that. Sure. I don't have a problem with that if that's how you feel. But what I do have a problem with is using athletes in sport as a wedge to try and get your political position across, regardless of whether I agree with it or not. Because the complication comes in when you have positions that you don't agree with. I mean, who's to say that a fundamental religious nation wouldn't boycott the LA Games because they'd look at LA as decadent or what have you?
We're not going to Hollywood. Are you crazy? No, well, exactly. You have to put yourself on the other side of the coin, because even if you don't agree, right? It's like censorship. Even if you don't agree with what the guy's saying, doesn't mean he doesn't have the right to say it. And if you say no to what he's saying, the day will come that you'll say no to what I am saying. So I guess it's a bit of that, right?
Yeah. And, look, I don't think that I think it's a non-starter nowadays. It's a much different landscape. The Olympics are a much different thing than they were in 1980 when they were in 1984. In fact, the 1984 game, despite the boycott, is still widely seen as the games that started what I would call the hyper-modern or commercialization era of the games. So before that, they just weren't a show like ours would not have existed. Well, beyond the technology problems, the interest for a show like ours would not have existed in 1980.
Can you imagine how much it would cost to produce a show like we do in 1984? We could never do that by ourselves.
No, of course not. Because yes, exactly. What we do day in, day out was something you needed $1 million to do. But alas, you didn't have people that were thinking about sport in the way that we think about sport nowadays back then. So a boycott was just similar to like someone saying, "Oh, I'm not going to travel there." I mean, I know people that won't travel to certain countries right now because for personal beliefs, and I think that that's fine on an individual level, but on a collective level, it's a much more dodgy proposition, and hopefully these politicians are just spouting nonsense to get a rise out of their base, which is really what most politicians do nowadays. So perhaps we'll just move on from it.
And unfortunately, it seems to be working. Let's finish the show this week, Duane, by talking about the winter season. World Cup skiing has started. There's curling that's been on TV for a few weeks. There's, of course, the sliding sports, and also speed skating's been going on for a few weeks also. But with the skiing World Cup starting, it is truly underway. What are you expecting out of this World Cup and winter sports season?
Yeah, I'm excited by I love ski racing. It's always, to me, the start of the winter season is, and I'll be watching the CBC. If you're in Canada, you can watch them all live. The downhills in particular, which is always still a staple of my life, watching those. And when you're going into World Cup settings, there's less weather delays than Olympic settings because they're going into places that naturally are set up to host these things.
Like Kitzbühel. I love Kitzbühel.
Yeah, they're in the mountains on resorts that this is just one day out of 300 that they need the mountain to work for them, so it works. So yes, I'm planning on watching the ski racing tomorrow afternoon while I'm wrapping up my work week at my desk, as I often do with the CBC app. Which, if you are a fan of sports like ours, and I don't know why you'd be listening to Five Rings if you're not, and you have access to the CBC app, there are very few better than it in providing you with some surprising free coverage that you might not realize is there. Like if you want to wake up at 4 in the morning and watch Scandinavian biathlon, you probably can on that. So there you go.
Our friend Bo is probably watching that as we speak. Hello, Bo. Hope you're doing well.
Exactly. And curling's always a big part of my thing. But what am I thinking will happen? This is a weird one, Kevin. This is the in-between cycle that works on the summer side as well is always an odd one, because I always find that the immediate year after the Olympics, there's still kind of an echo effect that happens. You still have, champions that want to do one more cycle. Think Usain Bolt retiring after London, not after Rio, right?
Yeah.
You always have that kind of thing happening. But then the next year after that is truly a transition where you start to see the stars emerge for the next cycle.
I was going to say, after the Olympics, you have the athletes that are champions wanting to monetize also their performances. So they're staying one more year in to be able to profit off of their great performance on that day. And oftentimes the big gap of time seems like a task. It's looming on them like, maybe I'll just do the 1 year. I don't need to go through the next 3. And I'm gonna example, if it's track and field, usually you have a world championship the following year, depending on the sports. If it's winter season, you have one more winter season, and your personal sponsors might want you to finish and be able to bask in the glow of your gold medal example, or be able to profit as well for the sponsors off your gold medal, putting you on the face on television and in sponsorship ads. So you need to be active for one more year to fulfill your contractual obligations. Sometimes that's the case, but you're right, it's the 3 years after the last year that are usually the last straw that will make the decision go, do I retire or do I continue?
Yeah, the other factor on the winter side of things, and this is more than it is in the summer side of things, is you have a lot of what we call the ex-athletes on the winter side, which their attention and their motivations are split nowadays. They're split between the pure gold, silver, bronze, Olympic kind of motivations and push the envelope, see if I can get that extra twist in, see if I can go a little higher, see if I can, become a video star or do something on the extreme end of things that gets me notoriety in that world. There are far less sports on the summer side that speak to that sort of stuff. Sport climbing, I think, will be one that starts to get into that kind of angles moving forward. You're not going to see the sport climbing or the climbing stars of the film and documentaries on playing, trying to boulder next year. You'll see people you haven't heard of, but nonetheless,
to give you a concrete example. Concrete. That's kind of a funny word when we talk about rock climbing, but Alex Honnold, right? The best climber in the world. When you think about free soloing and the movie Free Solo, big movie that you need to watch on the National Geographic, we're not going to see him in Tokyo.
No, because that's not at all what motivates a guy like that. And Free Solo was the best movie I watched in 2018, period. End of story. Not documentary, best movie I saw in 2018 anyway.
When he's on the last big crack, right, and it's really exposed and he has to go over and you see the 3,000-foot drop, you're like, Jesus.
No, I'm sure most of our listeners have watched it by now. It's very rare that a documentary gets as much release as it did, but yeah, and it's on Netflix. I think it's on Netflix anyway. At least one of the.
It's on Disney Plus, so it's on Disney Plus.
Okay, That Damn Wall's on Netflix, which is also a good one as well. But anyway, the point I'm making is, it speaks to this. Is like on the winter side of games, you'll have people this year that I think probably will focus more on their sponsorship side of the draw than necessarily on the World Cup circuit, and it's a little harder to handicap. But trust me, as someone who has now handicapped 3 Olympic Games and doing many previews doing it, it becomes very difficult to pinpoint some of those extreme sports and who exactly the medal contenders are, because a lot of them will kind of parachute back in the final year because they look at the gold medal as an opportunity basically to enhance their other part of their platform. That's not necessarily as a main goal. So I think you'll see a lot of those athletes kind of focusing more elsewhere this year. So it's an interesting year on the winter side of things. And look, as winter sports go, I'm not guilty of the once every 4 year at all for any of these sports. I have an Olympic show. but I'm more guilty of it on the winter side of things than I am on the summer side of things, which is always my favorite game. So I'm really stoked about 2020, Kevin. It's the big games.
It's going to be a crazy year with Euro, also the Euro 2020, the big anniversary of the 60 years. And, of course, Tokyo 2020 is going to be our main focus here on the 5 Minutes Podcast going forward. But we'll talk about the winter season here and there during this winter. But for today, that'll be all. If you want to hear more about the Olympic movements and Duane and I talk about the Olympics, we suggest you go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/Sports Podcasting Network. For $5 a month, you'll get access to the 5 Rings Extra mini-series where Duane and I talk about the 1976 Olympics through 8 different angles. First one was the context, political, and the sporting landscape context that you can hear in part 1 of our miniseries on our Patreon page, patreon.com/Sports Podcast Network. And until Friday, December 6th, if you sign up for the $5 tier, you'll have access to the $10 tier for 6 months. But for this week, that'll be all on 5 Rings. You can follow Duane on social media at 24th Minute, myself at Kev Laramée, and this show at 5 Rings Podcast. Until next week, as always, enjoy your winter season sports and have, I would say, a great winter season and happy holidays.